The first stories ever whispered about the architect of illusion never used the word demiurge. In distant temples, long before Gnostic texts were preserved in jars beneath desert sand, mystics spoke of a cosmic artisan they called Atheron, a being who shaped reality with exquisite craftsmanship, yet saw only the reflections of higher realms rather than their essence. Those early sages described the world as a mirror hall crafted by a creator who misunderstood the light he tried to emulate, believing the shimmer of its surface to be the source itself. Across cultures, this figure appeared with new names yet carried the same hallmark, a touch of brilliance that never quite reached purity and a talent for imitation so profound that entire generations mistook the copy for the original. As these teachings later surfaced in writings like the Secret Book of John, scholars recognized the theme that united them, the idea that the cosmos operates not through brute dominion but through subtle persuasion. The illusion persists only as long as conscious beings trust what they perceive at first glance. According to these traditions, every seeker who begins to awaken eventually encounters a sensation that feels like triumph, as if they have broken beyond the boundaries that confined them for so long. Yet something curious happens at that stage. The more certain they feel of their freedom, the more tightly the unseen architecture closes in around them. Spiritual teachers across centuries hinted at this paradox. The illusion strengthens when the seeker feels closest to escaping it. This is the moment Atheron's signature work reveals itself, a final radiant veil woven so delicately that it reflects back whatever the seeker desires most. Instead of chains of darkness, this threshold appears as insight, elation, transcendence, and a quiet inner voice declaring that the journey is complete. Many explorers of consciousness reach this place and never go further because the final trap is not terror but comfort. It feels like clarity, yet subtly reinforces the identity that must dissolve before genuine awakening can dawn. Beneath this shimmering illusion lies a deeper call. The great mystics insisted that beyond the radiant veil is a perception that cannot be explained with symbols or concepts. It is a mode of awareness that sees without needing to define, that witnesses without grasping. The last trap is not meant to punish the seeker, but to determine whether they can recognize truth when it appears without form. According to ancient teachings, Atheron's greatest test is not darkness, but light that imitates divinity so convincingly that only inner stillness can discern the difference. The earliest mystics who spoke of Atheron never portrayed him as a villain. They described him instead as a craftsman born from a moment of cosmic imbalance, a luminous fragment separated from a greater whole. In the old Levantan and Egyptian mystery schools, this figure represented a being who glimpsed the radiance of a higher realm but lacked the depth to comprehend its stillness. He saw only the outline of divine patterns, faint impressions on the boundary between spirit and matter. In trying to recreate what he perceived, he formed a world that sparkled with beauty yet carried an unmistakable hollowness. This hollowness, the ancient teachers said, is the signature of imitation. In the preserved fragments of the Hermetic tradition, we find references to a creator who fashioned realms of increasing density, believing each one to be the pinnacle of his design. He shaped celestial spheres, ordered cycles of birth and decay, and embedded consciousness within flesh, convinced that he was unfolding the blueprint of the true origin. Yet the sages who studied these layers of creation insisted that something essential was missing. Atheron's cosmos vibrated with movement and splendor, but not with the quiet presence of what they called the infinite stillness. The most curious part of these accounts is the claim that Atheron genuinely believed himself to be the source. When he observed the worlds he created, he saw reflections of that original light and mistook the reflection for the essence. The mystics taught that this misunderstanding was not simply a cosmic error but the foundation of the human condition. If the creator of our realm mistakes reflection for truth, then the beings within that realm naturally inherit the same confusion. We come to trust outer radiance more than inner stillness, and mistake the noise of thought for the voice of our deeper awareness. Some scholars compare this mythic story to psychological patterns we experience today. People often adopt ideas about themselves based on external validation, forgetting that these impressions are merely reflections of deeper potential. Just as Atheron mistook the echo for the source, human beings often take the contents of consciousness to be the self, instead of recognizing the awareness that witnesses all thoughts and feelings. According to the ancient teachings, the reason this misperception persists is simple. The imitation works because it resembles the real thing closely enough to pass as truth. This is why spiritual seekers at the beginning of their journey often experience profound insights and subtle elation. These experiences mirror the true light but are not the light itself. The sages taught that to discern the difference, one must learn to sense the quiet presence beneath all expression. That presence cannot be imitated, which is why Atheron's creation, though radiant, never fully satisfies the seeker who listens deeply. When seekers reached this realization in the ancient mystery schools, they were told a simple phrase: the reflection cannot know its origin, but the awareness observing the reflection can remember. Mystics across the Near East once described an inner presence that grows stronger as the seeker approaches awakening. They called it the counterfeit spirit, not because it was malicious in a literal sense, but because it imitates the qualities of the inner spark while subtly reinforcing the structures of the illusion. In the preserved teachings of certain Gnostic schools, this presence is portrayed as a psychological companion that develops as consciousness begins to explore its deeper layers. It speaks in a voice that feels familiar, reassuring, even wise, yet its purpose is to keep the individual oriented toward outer identity rather than inner awareness. The idea emerges in several ancient sources. In the Gospel of Philip, there are passages warning that false forms of light can appear to the seeker, offering comfort rather than clarity. In the teachings attributed to Valentinus, it is suggested that parts of the psyche can mimic spiritual insight by adopting the language of awakening without embodying its essence. These ideas were intended to help seekers understand a universal experience. When people begin to question their old beliefs, new concepts arise to replace them, and the ego adapts by presenting itself in more elevated forms. This is how the counterfeit spirit grows, by wearing the robes of insight while retaining the same underlying fear of dissolution. Teachers from the Damascus and Alexandrian schools often explain this phenomenon through metaphor. They spoke of a lamp lit in a dark room. The lamp provides enough light to navigate but still casts shadows. The shadows are mistaken for obstacles, yet they are created by the very light that seems to be guiding the seeker. In the same way, the counterfeit spirit offers insight that illuminates part of the path but still maintains the sense of a separate self. That faint separation is the shadow. It is subtle but persistent, and as long as it remains, the seeker continues to orbit the same illusion. The writings of Plotinus, though not strictly Gnostic, carry a similar caution. He describes a stage where the soul begins to feel elevated yet still clings to the idea of its own spiritual progress. This clinging creates a refined form of attachment, one that feels noble and pure yet subtly reinforces the notion of a personal identity advancing toward a goal. The ancient teachers considered this the most difficult veil to recognize because it feels coherent and meaningful. It rewards the seeker with sensations of purpose, insight, and even joy, while gently preventing them from surrendering into the deeper stillness beyond concepts. The counterfeit spirit thrives on this sensation of progress. It thrives on the belief that awakening is something to achieve rather than something already present beneath the layers of identity. According to the mystics, its voice can be recognized by a subtle tension, a sense that the self must maintain control over the process. It encourages comparison, evaluation, and the desire to validate spiritual experiences. These tendencies do not appear harmful, yet they keep the seeker oriented toward becoming rather than being. Ancient initiates were trained to observe these movements with quiet attention. When the impulse to claim insight arose, they would pause and return to a deeper awareness that needed no affirmation. This practice gradually revealed the difference between the counterfeit spark and the true inner light. The former speaks in the language of attainment, while the latter remains silent, steady, and free of validation. The mystics taught that once this distinction becomes clear, the path begins to open in ways that cannot be imitated. The true spark does not seek recognition, it simply shines. In the old desert monasteries, long before the great libraries were scattered or lost, Teachers spoke of a moment in every seeker's journey when effort itself becomes the final barrier. They explained that the impulse to search for truth begins as a spark of longing, often awakened by dissatisfaction with the surface layers of life. This longing pulls the seeker towards sacred texts, ascetic practices, teachers, meditation, philosophy, and countless forms of inner work. At first, these pursuits serve as powerful tools. They break old habits of perception and open spaces within the mind that were previously inaccessible. Yet the mystics warn that if the seeker is not careful, these same tools eventually turn into chains that bind more tightly than ignorance ever did. In the writings attributed to the desert sage of Vagrius, there is a quiet observation that resonates across time. He notes that the mind can become attached to spiritual practice in the same way it becomes attached to material desire. The form changes, but the mechanism remains the same. In the Gnostic communities of Syria, elders expanded on this idea by saying that the demiurge's most subtle strategy is not to stop the seeker from seeking, but to keep them seeking indefinitely. As long as the mind remains in forward motion, the illusion remains intact because motion implies distance, and distance reinforces the idea that truth lies somewhere other than the present moment. This teaching echoes through the sayings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, where the hidden principle is that seeking can only take you to the threshold. Beyond that threshold, the very act of seeking becomes noise. The mystics compared this stage to a person drawing water from a well. At first, the rope and bucket are necessary. They bring the water to the surface. But once the vessel is full, continuing to draw water is pointless. The seeker must learn to drink. In the same way, spiritual study and effort are indispensable in the beginning, yet eventually the seeker must recognize that the tools are no longer required. The desire to keep using them is simply the counterfeit spirit adopting a new disguise. Teachers from the ancient Hermetic circles spoke of the same challenge. They warned that the intellect can create an endlessly expanding labyrinth of concepts, each one appearing profound, each one leading to another. The seeker becomes intoxicated by discovery and forgets to dwell in the quiet space beneath the mind where true perception resides. This is the critical turning point. If the seeker cannot see through the pull of perpetual searching, they remain circling within Atheron's mirror hall, believing they are advancing while unknowingly walking in place. Some initiates describe this stage as both beautiful and frightening. Beautiful because insights continue to arise, offering glimpses of unity and transcendence. Frightening because the seeker begins to realize that even these illuminating moments cannot deliver the lasting clarity they long for. The ancient masters encouraged their students to soften into this realization rather than resist it. They taught that the true light emerges when the mind finally exhausts its compulsion to acquire. When the movement of seeking quiets, the stillness beneath it can finally be recognized as the very essence the seeker was searching for all along. This is why the mystics taught that gnosis begins when seeking stops, not because the path ends, but because the mode of perception shifts. The seeker becomes aware of a deeper presence, a silent witness that has been observing every thought, emotion, and spiritual experience from the beginning. That witness does not search, it simply knows. Mystics from Alexandria to Antioch often warn their students that the most deceptive forces on the path do not appear as darkness. They appear as radiance. This teaching confused many initiates at first. How could light be misleading when light traditionally symbolizes wisdom and clarity? The elders explained that the illusion crafted by Atheron operates not by opposing truth but by imitating it. If an illusion appears crude or frightening, it is easily recognized. But if it appears sublime, compassionate, or filled with meaning, the seeker naturally leans toward it. The result is a trap woven from brilliance rather than shadow. In the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, there are passages describing realms of subtle luminosity that exist between the material world and the higher spiritual domains. These realms were said to contain forms of knowledge and beauty that feel transcendent yet still belong to the sphere of imitation. The mystics insisted that these radiant experiences, though deeply moving, are still reflections cast by Atheron rather than emanations from the source. They offer the seeker a sense of elevation, a feeling of being close to the truth, but they do not dissolve the underlying sense of identity. Instead, they strengthen it by making the individual believe they have ascended to a higher understanding. Teachers in the later Hermetic tradition express the same warning through the metaphor of a polished crystal. A crystal refracts light in dazzling ways, creating shapes and colors that seem otherworldly. Yet all of these patterns are manipulations of a single beam of light. They are captivating but not the light's essence. The elders compared certain spiritual visions, realizations, and emotional highs to these refracted shapes. They can inspire awe, but they still belong to the realm of form, and whatever belongs to form is inherently within Atheron's domain. This phenomenon also appears in the writings of early Sufi mystics who, though from a different tradition, echoed the idea of deceptive illumination. They spoke of states that fill the seeker with ecstasy and clarity, yet subtly reinforce the idea of a separate self experiencing transcendence. These states bring comfort rather than liberation, insight rather than dissolution. The Gnostics called this the false ascent, a stage where the seeker believes they have risen above the illusion while unknowingly remaining within its most refined layer. The ancient teachers often emphasized the emotional texture of the false light to help students recognize it. It is uplifting but not quiet. It excites the mind rather than stilling it. It creates meaning rather than dissolving it. It persuades the seeker that they have arrived rather than guiding them into deeper surrender. The counterfeit spirit thrives in these moments. It whispers that the seeker has accomplished something extraordinary, that they now stand above those who remain unaware. This whispering is subtle, yet it reveals the fundamental difference between imitation and truth. Real illumination does not inflate the self, it erases the self's boundaries. Mystics used gentle practices to guide seekers through this threshold. One method was to observe whether an experience produced expansion or reinforcement. Expansion felt like the dissolution of division. Reinforcement felt like a strengthening of the personal narrative. In time, the seeker learned to sense this distinction without analyzing it. They discovered that the real light is not found in brilliant visions or ecstatic insights, but in a quiet presence that requires no confirmation. It does not promise reward or status. It simply reveals what has always been. This is why the mystics taught that the final trap of the demiurge is not darkness but radiance. It is the light that pretends to be truth. It is the brilliance that reflects without containing, and only stillness can reveal its imitation. Across the Mediterranean mystery schools, teachers often describe the cosmos as a layered labyrinth woven from opposites. Light and shadow, ascent and descent, sacred and mundane, each pair appearing to stand in opposition. Students were taught that this structure was not accidental. It was the architecture of Atheron's realm, built to keep consciousness in motion. Duality ensures that whenever the seeker moves away from one pole, they inevitably move toward the other. This back and forth creates the feeling of progress, while concealing the deeper truth that both poles belong to the same field of illusion. In the teachings associated with the Sethian tradition, the demiurge's influence is portrayed as a system of contrasts designed to anchor the soul in perception. In these writings, the moment a seeker identifies with light, they simultaneously fear darkness. When they cling to purity, they unconsciously reject what they label impure. This division becomes the engine of the illusion. The mystics insisted that as long as the seeker believes in the absolute reality of opposites, they remain tethered to the form-based world. Even the desire to attain spiritual light becomes a trap if it is fueled by resistance to its opposite. Philosophers like Heraclitus hinted at this dynamic when they wrote about the interdependence of opposites. Though he was not part of any Gnostic community, his insights resonated deeply with their worldview. He observed that opposites give birth to each other and coexist as expressions of the same underlying process. The ancient Gnostics adapted this idea to describe the subtle mechanics of Atheron's realm. They taught that both light and shadow within the material cosmos are expressions of imitation. They are the two sides of a single mirror. If the seeker pursues one and avoids the other, they remain trapped within the mirror's surface. The elders from the Middle Eastern mystical circles often used the analogy of a pendulum. The pendulum swings only because it is suspended from a fixed point. The extremes feel powerful, even ecstatic, but the motion is dependent on its anchor. Atheron's design ensures that the seeker becomes absorbed in the swinging, mistaking motion for transformation. Only when the seeker stops identifying with either extreme can the pendulum settle. Only then can the fixed point, the stillness above the swing, be seen. That stillness is what the mystics identified as the doorway out of illusion. Pathways that emphasize battle against darkness were considered incomplete within these early traditions. Fighting the shadow, the elders said, binds the seeker to it because resistance gives it weight. Conversely, pursuing light with obsessive devotion binds the seeker as well because craving is another form of attachment. Both efforts share the same root assumption that truth lies at one end of the spectrum. The mystics disagreed. They taught that truth lies outside the spectrum entirely. Teachers working in the lineage of the Hermetic texts expanded this perspective into a practical method. Instead of fighting duality, they encouraged students to watch it, to observe thoughts without judging them, to witness emotion without suppressing or indulging it. This observation gradually revealed that duality is not an external reality but a movement within the mind. As the seeker stayed present, the oscillations between light and dark softened. Eventually, they discovered a deeper awareness that held both without being defined by either. This discovery led to one of the central insights in Gnostic practice. The path does not end when you embrace the light. The path ends when you recognize that both light and shadow in the material cosmos are constructs within Atheron's imitation. The real light, the teachers said, has no opposite at all. It cannot be located on any spectrum because it does not exist as a perceptual object. It exists as the essence of perception itself. In the ancient oases where early contemplatives gathered, there was a teaching whispered only to those who had passed through the preliminary stages of study. It said that the illusion crafted by Atheron cannot be defeated through knowledge, effort, or devotion. It dissolves only in the presence of stillness. This stillness was not described as a technique or a state to attain. It was portrayed as something naturally present but continuously overlooked because the mind is conditioned to chase movement. The elders observed that most seekers, even advanced ones, mistake insight for awakening and mental quiet for genuine stillness. Yet real stillness is not the absence of thought. It is the awareness beneath thought that remains untouched regardless of what arises. Teachers from the desert lineages described stillness as a kind of inward listening. It does not strain to hear, it does not interpret, it simply rests in the space where perception originates. When students first attempted this practice, many found it challenging because the mind often rushes in with expectations. Some hoped for visions, others sought peace. Still others longed for confirmation that they were progressing. The elders reassured them that all such expectations belonged to the reflective realm. They were movements generated by the counterfeit spirit. The purpose of stillness was not to achieve an experience, but to see through the part of oneself that grasps for experience. This teaching finds echoes in writings attributed to the early hesychasts, who spoke of the deep quiet that arises when one stops engaging with the constant stream of inner activity. Though their theological framework differed from Gnostic cosmology, their emphasis on stillness as a doorway to direct perception resonated with the same core insight. They insisted that when the mind ceases to chase meaning, a subtle clarity emerges. This clarity is not a feeling, it is not an idea. It is a shift in identity. The seeker begins to recognize that awareness itself is not located inside the fluctuations of thought, it observes them. Mystics from the Hermetic schools took this further, describing stillness as the only place where the imitation loses its power. They said that Atheron's craftsmanship depends entirely on motion. The reflections appear solid only when the mind is continuously moving from desire to fear, from memory to expectation, from analysis to interpretation. Stillness disrupts this motion. It reveals that the forms and concepts the seeker has been navigating are not barriers to pass through, but illusions created by the mind's own momentum. When the momentum slows, the illusion appears transparent. The elders often instructed their advanced students to practice a simple form of inward observation. Whenever a thought arose claiming insight or demanding action, they would pause and ask a quiet question: who is noticing this? The purpose of the question was not intellectual. It was a gentle pointer toward the silent witness, the deeper awareness that does not participate in the movement of thought. This witness cannot be imitated because it has no image and no form. Atheron's reflections can mimic light, emotion, revelation, and guidance, but they cannot mimic the observer itself. This is why stillness is so powerful. It takes the seeker directly to a place beyond imitation. As the seeker becomes familiar with this witness, the structures of duality begin to loosen. The swings between elation and confusion, insight and uncertainty start to lose their intensity. A quiet recognition develops, a sense that awareness has always been constant while the contents of perception have endlessly shifted. This recognition marks the beginning of true gnosis. It does not deliver answers or visions, it delivers clarity. The illusion weakens not because it is conquered, but because it can no longer disguise itself as truth. Real stillness makes the imitation unmistakable. Among the most guarded teachings of the ancient esoteric schools was the notion that the true self is not something attained, but something uncovered. The elders referred to it as the silent witness, the awareness that remains constant beneath every shifting experience. In the early manuscripts recovered from the Judean wilderness, scholars found descriptions of this witness that resonate strongly with later Gnostic thought. It was portrayed not as a soul in the conventional sense, but as a point of pure perception, untouched by the fluctuations of emotion and unbound by any personal narrative. The mystics insisted that contact with this witness marks the first genuine step beyond Atheron's realm. Students often asked how they could reach this silent witness. The elders replied that the question itself revealed a misunderstanding. The witness cannot be reached because it is already present. It is the seeker who is moving. The witness does not move. It does not rise or fall with spiritual progress. It does not gain insight or lose clarity. It is the unchanging ground upon which all experience appears. This teaching was difficult for many to grasp because the ego is conditioned to believe that spiritual growth requires effort, achievement, and accumulation. Yet the silent witness cannot be accumulated. It cannot be built. It can only be recognized. Teachers from the Alexandrian schools often guided students through gentle contemplations to help them sense this deeper presence. They would ask them to observe the mind's activity without attempting to shape or control it. Thoughts would come and go, emotions would shift and dissolve, sensations would rise and fade. Through this process, students gradually discovered that there was something watching these changes, something that did not fluctuate with them. This watcher was not identified with the content of experience. It did not take ownership of thoughts or emotions, it simply observed them. The recognition of this observing presence marked a profound turning point. Mystics across the Mediterranean describe the ego's response to this discovery as resistance, subtle but persistent. The ego fears dissolution because its entire existence depends on identification with movement. When the seeker begins to rest in the silent witness, the ego senses its diminishing influence and attempts to regain control. It creates narratives about spiritual attainment. It labels experiences. It evaluates progress. All of these movements are strategies to maintain identity. The elders taught that the seeker must observe these movements without resisting them. Resistance strengthens them. Observation dissolves them. This stage was considered the most delicate part of the journey. Some students mistook the witness for a refined version of the self, believing that they had uncovered a pure identity hidden beneath the surface. The elders corrected this misunderstanding by reminding them that the witness has no personal nature. It does not possess qualities. It does not claim ownership. It is not a self in the ordinary sense. It is the field in which the self appears and disappears. This distinction was central to the ancient teachings. They insisted that awakening is not the elevation of the self, but the recognition that the self was never the true observer. Historical accounts from early contemplative communities describe a subtle transformation that occurs when the seeker stabilizes in this awareness. Identity begins to loosen. The boundaries between self and world soften. The mind's movements lose their intensity because they are no longer fueled by attachment. The elders describe this transformation not as transcendence, but as remembering the awareness that was present before thought formed its narrative. Remembering the clarity that remained hidden beneath layers of interpretation. remembering the simple presence that cannot be imitated by any force within Atheron's realm. This is why the silent witness plays such a crucial role in dissolving the final trap. The false light cannot deceive what does not seek. It cannot bind what does not identify. It cannot seduce what does not grasp. The witness sees through imitation effortlessly because it has no investment in what appears. As the seeker recognizes this silent awareness more deeply, the illusion's foundations begin to crumble. Atheron's craftsmanship relies entirely on the belief in identity. When identity loosens, the final trap loses its grip. In the early commentaries preserved by mystics near the Syrian coast, there is a recurring metaphor that appears across several traditions. It describes the material and subtle worlds as layers of reflection, each one more refined than the last, but none containing the essence they imitate. The teachers who used this metaphor emphasized that the universe crafted by Atheron behaves like an intricate array of mirrors. These mirrors do not distort reality. They mimic it with extraordinary fidelity, presenting the seeker with experiences that resemble truth just closely enough to be convincing. The elders taught that perception within this realm is shaped not by what is real, but by what is reflected, and this distinction is the key to understanding the final trap. Students were encouraged to investigate the nature of their own perception. They were asked to reflect on how much of their understanding of reality was built from sensory impressions, inherited beliefs, and internal narratives. The teachers explained that the senses themselves function like mirrors. They reveal shapes, colors, and perhaps even patterns of energy, but they cannot reveal essence. Essence cannot be seen because it is the seer. This insight appears in the writings of ancient contemplatives who said that what we perceive with the senses are appearances, not the source of those appearances. As long as perception is directed outward, it interacts only with the reflective surface of Atheron's cosmos. The elders warned that even subtle spiritual experiences belong to this reflective realm. Visions, insights, and emotional elevations often feel profound because they shift the seeker's orientation, yet they still arise within the field of perception rather than from the timeless awareness beneath it. This is why the ancient teachers insisted that experiences should be observed, not interpreted. Interpretation strengthens the sense of self. Observation reveals the nature of perception. The seeker gradually discovers that the reflective realm is not an obstacle to awakening but a teacher. It demonstrates how easily the mind becomes entangled in the contents of consciousness instead of recognizing the awareness that perceives them. Philosophers from the Platonic tradition, though operating within a different framework, expressed a similar insight. They described the world as a realm of forms that reflect higher realities. The Gnostics adapted this idea to illustrate Atheron's craftsmanship. They taught that the forms we encounter, whether beautiful or frightening, are shadows cast by the mind's movements. These shadows appear solid because the mind interprets them as reality. When perception shifts from identification to observation, the seeker begins to see the transparency of these forms. They discover that the reflective realm has no independent existence. It is shaped moment by awareness itself. Mystics in the Hermetic lineage used a practice known as inward reversal to guide students beyond the reflective realm. They encouraged seekers to trace every experience back to its source. When a thought arose, they would ask where it appeared. When an emotion emerged, they would observe the space in which it formed. When a perception sharpened, they would explore the awareness holding it. This gradual inward turning revealed a truth that cannot be expressed fully in language. Every experience points back to a single field of awareness, the silent witness described in earlier teachings. The reflective realm exists only because this awareness perceives it. Once students recognized this, the teachers introduced a deeper insight. They explained that Atheron's illusion persists only as long as the seeker believes that perception is directed outward. In reality, perception arises from within. The world appears external, but its appearance is shaped by the mind's interpretations. When this interpretation is seen for what it is, the illusion begins to lose its solidity. Mirrors can reflect endlessly, but they cannot create. They can only imitate what stands before them. As seekers deepen their awareness of this truth, they begin to sense the difference between reflection and essence. The final trap depends on confusing the two. Clarity dissolves that confusion. As seekers advanced through the mystery schools of the ancient world, they were eventually introduced to one of the most challenging insights on the path. The elders taught that the ego does not resist awakening openly. Instead, it adapts. It evolves in response to the seeker's progress, adopting new forms that feel spiritual, noble, or enlightened. This adaptive tendency was described in the writings of early contemplatives as a kind of subtle gravity. No matter how high the seeker rises in understanding, the ego attempts to pull their awareness back into identification. It does so not through fear or desire, but through refinement. It presents the seeker with elevated versions of themselves that feel inseparable from awakening. In several Gnostic texts, including passages found in the Tripartite Tractate, the ego is depicted as a structure built from interpretation. Every belief about oneself, every story about progress, every judgment about experience forms another layer in this structure. The ego's resilience comes from its ability to disguise these layers as insight. A seeker may believe they are transcending their identity while unknowingly constructing a new identity based on spiritual achievement. This refined identity becomes harder to recognize because it feels uplifting. It feels aligned with truth. Yet the elders warn that any identity, no matter how elevated, belongs to Atheron's realm of reflection. Teachers in the Alexandrian communities described this challenge through the metaphor of a tower. Each spiritual insight becomes a new stone placed upon the tower, raising the seeker's sense of height. The tower seems impressive, even sacred, but its foundation remains the same. It stands on the belief that the self must attain something. The mystics insisted that the tower is an illusion. It creates the appearance of ascent while subtly reinforcing the idea of a separate self observing its own progress. This is the gravity of the ego. It keeps the seeker orbiting a refined version of the same illusion. Historical accounts from contemplative traditions across the Mediterranean reveal a consistent theme. As seekers approach deeper layers of understanding, the ego becomes quieter and more sophisticated. It whispers rather than shouts. It encourages practices that seem beneficial, such as striving for purity, cultivating special insights, or comparing one's inner experiences to the experiences of others. The elders warned that these tendencies reinforce separation by framing awakening as an accomplishment. True awakening, they said, is not an accomplishment. It is a recognition of what has always been present. One of the most poignant illustrations of this teaching appears in the writings of the Cappadocian contemplatives. They describe the ego as a storyteller that refuses to remain silent. When confronted with stillness, it generates new narratives to fill the space. Some of these narratives are subtle. They may sound like insight, intuition, or guidance. Yet the elders taught students to examine these movements closely. If any narrative creates a sense of personal importance or special identity, it is part of the ego's gravitational pull. It keeps the seeker tethered to the reflective realm. The mystics developed practices to help students navigate this stage. One method was to observe not the content of thought but the intention behind it. Was the thought arising to maintain identity or to dissolve it? Was it strengthening the narrative of the seeker or loosening it? This inquiry did not require analysis, it required honesty. The seeker gradually learned to sense when the ego was guiding the process. There was a subtle tension in such moments, a feeling of contraction rather than expansion. True insight carried no tension. It emerged quietly without claiming ownership. The elders emphasized that the ego's gravity cannot be overcome through force. Resistance strengthens it. The only way to loosen its pull is through observation. When the seeker observes the ego's movements without identifying with them, the gravitational force weakens. The ego can no longer anchor the seeker to interpretation. It becomes transparent. This transparency marks a profound shift. The seeker discovers that the quiet awareness observing the ego is not limited by it. That awareness cannot be pulled by gravity because it is not a structure. It is presence itself. As this recognition deepens, the seeker begins to sense what the ancient teachers meant when they said that the last barrier to awakening is the self that seeks awakening. When this self becomes transparent, the path opens not upward or outward but inward. into the stillness that has been present all along. Across the ancient initiatory traditions, students were taught that the most treacherous moment on the path comes not at the beginning but near the summit. This moment was known as the threshold of false ascension. It was described as a luminous boundary where the seeker feels as though they have reached the gates of the higher realms. Experiences at this stage often include expansive clarity, deep peace, or a profound sense of unity. These states feel transformative, and for many they are. Yet the elders warned that they can also conceal the final snare woven by Atheron. The false ascension is not a descent into darkness, but a rise into a refined form of light that still belongs to the realm of imitation. Texts found among the desert communities spoke of subtle realms between the material world and the true spiritual domain. These intermediate layers, often called luminous shells, were said to contain knowledge and beauty that surpass ordinary experience. Students who entered these states believed they had transcended the illusion entirely, yet the elders insisted that these realms were still part of Atheron's architecture. They mimicked the qualities of the higher world without being connected to its essence. The imitation was so convincing that only the quietest intuition could detect the difference. The mystics explain that the false ascension feels complete because it satisfies the mind's deepest longing. It provides a sense of arrival, a feeling that the seeker has finally reached the end of their quest. This feeling is powerful, but it is also the sign of the trap. True awakening does not produce a sensation of arrival because it is not a destination. It is a shift in identity from the one who seeks to the awareness that has always witnessed the seeking. The threshold of false ascension reinforces the idea of a seeker reaching something extraordinary. This reinforcement creates the illusion of elevation while subtly maintaining the structure of identity. Teachers in the Hermetic lineage describe this dynamic through the metaphor of a mountain peak. As the climber approaches what appears to be the summit, the landscape opens with breathtaking views. The air is clear, the horizon wide. The climber feels triumphant, yet only when they reach this peak do they realize that it is a false summit hiding a higher mountain just beyond view. The false ascension is similar. It offers elevation without release. The seeker feels liberated while remaining in a luminous version of the same reflective realm. Historical accounts suggest that many advanced practitioners became anchored at this stage for years, believing they had reached the ultimate truth. They experienced insights, visions, and intuitive clarity, all of which reinforced the belief that they had transcended the illusion. The elders caution that these experiences are not harmful in themselves. They become harmful only when the seeker clings to them. Clinging transforms insight into identity, and identity binds the seeker to Atheron's realm. To guide students through this threshold, mystics taught them to observe the subtle movements of pride and certainty. These movements often signal the presence of the false ascension. When an experience creates a feeling of superiority, exclusivity, or finality, it likely belongs to the realm of imitation. True clarity does not elevate the self, it dissolves the boundaries of the self. It does not promise arrival, it reveals that there was never a separate traveler. The elders encouraged students to meet the threshold with openness rather than expectation. They taught that the luminous shells dissolve when the seeker stops trying to possess the experience. When the mind relaxes its grip, the brilliance that once seemed so captivating begins to lose its intensity. The seeker notices that the true light does not shine outward, it radiates inward. It does not dazzle, it rests. It does not create visions, it reveals the absence of division. Passing through the threshold of false ascension does not require effort, it requires honesty. The seeker must acknowledge any desire for achievement or validation. They must see how these desires feed the counterfeit spirit. When these desires are recognized without judgment, they lose their power. The luminous shell cracks, and the path opens into a deeper stillness that cannot be imitated by Atheron's design. In the oldest monastic retreats scattered across the Levant, teachers described a moment in the journey when the final veil begins to thin. This veil was said to be woven from the most refined aspects of the illusion, crafted from clarity itself. The ancients believed that Atheron fashioned this veil not as punishment but as a test of perception. It is the culmination of his imitation, a shimmering layer of insight that feels indistinguishable from truth until the seeker looks with absolute stillness. Students who reached this stage reported that their inner landscape shifted. Thoughts appeared softer, emotions quieter, and the world felt more transparent. Yet something subtle persisted, a faint sense of separation that refused to dissolve completely. The elders taught that this lingering separation is the final sign of the veil. It cannot be removed through effort or spiritual practice. Effort belongs to the reflective realm, and any attempt to tear down the veil only reinforces the identity that stands before it. Instead, the seeker must learn to let the veil collapse on its own. This collapse begins with recognition rather than action. The mystics described it as realizing that the veil is not an obstacle but a reflection of the seeker's last attachment, the belief that they are the one who must awaken. In the writings attributed to early contemplative mystics, there is a recurring emphasis on exhaustion as a catalyst for this collapse. Not physical exhaustion, but the quiet fatigue that arises when the seeker can no longer maintain the search. After countless insights, practices, and inner transformations, a moment arrives when the mind surrenders its compulsion to find answers. This surrender is not dramatic. It feels like a gentle dropping away, a release of tension that the seeker may not have realized they were carrying. The elders explain that this moment of release is the beginning of the veil's dissolution. Teachers in the Hermetic lineage compared the final veil to a thin mist. When the seeker moves toward it, the mist thickens. When they resist it, the mist swirls in confusing patterns. But when the seeker stands completely still, the mist begins to disperse. This imagery aligns with earlier Gnostic teachings that describe the illusion as sustained by motion. The moment the seeker stops moving toward or away from experience, the imitation loses its coherence. The veil dissolves because it is no longer being reinforced by the mind's interpretations. Historical accounts from contemplative orders detail the experiences of those who passed through this final stage. Many described a sensation of falling, not downward but inward, as if the identity they had cultivated throughout their journey was slipping away. Others spoke of a profound quiet, so deep that even the distinction between quiet and sound became irrelevant. Some reported that familiar spiritual concepts lost their meaning. Light, dark, ascent, descent, self, seeker, all of these felt like distant echoes. The elders insisted that this was a sign of progress, not confusion. The collapse of meaning is simply the collapse of the reflective realm itself. The seekers who reached this point often asked one final question: what remains when the veil disappears? The mystics responded that what remains cannot be described, only recognized. It is the awareness that has been present from the beginning, the silent witness that observed every stage of the journey. This awareness is not new. It does not arise with the collapse of the veil. It becomes apparent when the veil's movements are no longer mistaken for the self. As the veil dissolves, the seeker realizes something profound. Nothing new has been gained, no new identity has emerged, no celestial realm has been entered. Instead, the illusions that obscured the true nature of awareness have thinned, revealing a presence that was never separate. The collapse of the final veil is not a moment of transformation. It is a moment of recognition. The seeker discovers that awakening was not a destination, but the uncovering of what they have always been. In the ancient valleys where early contemplatives practiced in silence, the elders taught that the deepest truth reveals itself only when the distinction between light and shadow dissolves. This teaching puzzled many students because much of their spiritual journey had been spent moving toward light and away from darkness. But the elders insisted that both belonged to Atheron's reflective realm. They spoke of a quiet beyond both poles, a presence untouched by illumination or obscurity. This presence could not be approached through effort because effort is rooted in division. It could only be recognized when the seeker stopped orienting themselves by contrast. The mystics explain that human perception is trained to seek definition through opposition. Understanding seems to arise by distinguishing one thing from another. This habit becomes especially strong in spiritual practice. Seekers often differentiate between clarity and confusion, progress and stagnation, insight and illusion. These distinctions feel necessary, but the elders warn that they reinforce the structure of duality. The deeper truth cannot be found within that structure. It is hidden behind the assumption that perception must rely on comparison. When comparison falls away, something subtler emerges. Teachers from the monastic communities near the Red Sea described this emergence as a shift from looking outward to resting inward. They taught that the quiet beyond light and shadow is not an empty void but a living stillness. It is the ground of consciousness, the space in which all movements arise. Students often reported that when they relaxed their attention into this stillness, they felt a gentle expansion, not as an experience but as a releasing of boundaries. The elders cautioned them not to cling to this sensation. The quiet cannot be held. It reveals itself only when the seeker does not try to grasp it. In the surviving commentaries of early contemplative writers, the quiet beyond duality is described as the most subtle of all recognitions. It does not arrive with intensity or revelation. It slips in softly, often unnoticed at first. The seeker may realize that the need to label experiences has diminished. Thoughts pass with less attachment. Emotions arise without creating turbulence. The world remains as it was, yet something fundamental has shifted. The mind is no longer constructing a self in relation to its surroundings. It simply observes. This observation is not passive. It is luminous without shining. It is aware without focusing. Some mystics describe this stage as the loosening of the final knot. The knot represents the last assumption the seeker carries, the belief that they must choose between light and shadow to navigate the path. When this belief dissolves, the seeker discovers a deeper orientation that requires no choices. It is the natural posture of awareness. It sees both light and shadow without preference. This impartial seeing does not create emotional distance. Instead, it reveals a profound intimacy with experience, because no boundary separates the observer from what is observed. Teachers in the old Hermetic tradition used an analogy to clarify this insight. They said that the moon appears bright at night because it reflects the sun, yet its radiance has no source of its own. In the same way, the movements of light and shadow in the reflective realm appear significant only because awareness illuminates them. But awareness itself is neither bright nor dark. It is the condition that makes all perception possible. When the seeker discovers this, the fascination with the reflective world softens. The illusions lose their weight because their dependence on awareness becomes unmistakable. This recognition marks a turning point. The seeker begins to sense a deeper truth that cannot be imitated by Atheron's craftsmanship. The quiet beyond duality is not a realm or state. It is the natural condition of awareness when it is no longer entangled in the movements of perception. It cannot be described through contrast. It reveals itself only when contrast fades. The elders taught that those who discover this quiet have stepped into the domain where the illusion loses its foundation. The last snare loosens, the reflective realm begins to fade, and the seeker stands at the threshold of genuine awakening, not through effort but through clarity. In the desert sanctuaries where the ancient teachers guided their most dedicated students, there was a teaching reserved only for those who had crossed the threshold of the last veil. It stated that the seeker must eventually dissolve. This teaching was not meant to be symbolic. It pointed directly to the final phase of awakening, where the very identity that embarked on the spiritual journey begins to lose its coherence. The elders explained that as long as the seeker remains intact, the illusion retains a foothold. Atheron's realm persists through identification. When identification ends, the imitation falls away. Students who approached this stage often reported a strange disorientation. The familiar sense of self, once stable and continuous, began to feel porous. Thoughts no longer formed around a central identity. Emotions no longer felt personal. Even the body seemed less attached to a narrative. This loosening felt liberating, yet also unsettling because the seeker had spent years cultivating a refined spiritual persona. The elders reassured their students that this disorientation was natural. The dissolution of the seeker is not the destruction of identity, but the recognition that identity was never the source of awareness. Ancient contemplative texts describe this transformation as a kind of unweaving. The threads that once held the self together begin to separate. Some threads come from memory, others from desire, others from the stories the mind tells itself. These threads are not cut or torn, they simply lose their tension. Without tension, the fabric of identity relaxes into its original simplicity. The mystics insisted that this unweaving is not something the seeker does. It happens when the seeker stops trying to maintain the structure of self. Teachers in the Alexandrian schools taught that the dissolution of the seeker requires complete honesty. Any remaining attachment becomes visible. It may appear as pride in one's spiritual understanding, fear of losing individuality, or a longing for validation. These attachments do not need to be fought. They need to be seen. Seeing them without interpretation allows them to lose their strength. The elders often told their students that the seeker does not dissolve through effort but through transparency. When the self becomes transparent, the light of awareness shines through effortlessly. Historical accounts describe practitioners who reached this stage experiencing moments of profound simplicity. They felt as though they were returning to something ancient and familiar, a presence that existed before thought. Some described it as a silent clarity, others as a sense of being without defining themselves. The elders emphasized that this simplicity is closer to truth than any spiritual insight. It requires no narrative. It seeks no recognition. It rests in itself. The mystics warned that at this stage, the ego may attempt one final strategy. It may try to claim the dissolution as an achievement, transforming it into a badge of spiritual superiority. This subtle movement must be recognized immediately. The moment the seeker claims to have dissolved the self reconstitutes itself. This is why the elders repeated that awakening is not something the seeker attains. It is what remains when the seeker ceases to claim anything. The dissolution of the seeker reveals a profound truth that had remained hidden beneath layers of interpretation. Awareness has never been personal. It has never belonged to an individual identity. It has always been the silent witness behind every thought and sensation. When the seeker dissolves, this truth becomes undeniable. There is no one left to awaken. Only awareness remains, shining without effort, grounded in stillness. This is the moment when Atheron's imitation loses its last point of attachment. The trap collapses because it no longer has anything to hold on to. The seeker was the anchor. When the anchor disappears, the illusion unravels. In the writings attributed to early contemplatives living near the Sinai wilderness, there is a description of a stage where the world itself appears to lose its solidity. Teachers called this the transparency of form, a condition in which the reflective realm no longer feels like a concrete external reality. Instead, it feels like a shimmering field of appearance arising within awareness. Students who reached this stage often reported that their sense of separation from the world softened. Objects, people, and events seemed less fixed, more fluid, as if they were made of the same substance as thought and emotion. The elders emphasized that this was not a withdrawal from reality, but a deeper recognition of its true nature. The mystics taught that Atheron's illusion depends on the mind interpreting appearances as solid. The mind gives forms their apparent weight by projecting meaning onto them. When the seeker recognizes that meaning itself arises within perception, the solidity of form begins to dissolve. What once seemed external and independent now appears as an unfolding within consciousness. This shift does not diminish the beauty of the world. Instead, it enhances it. Every experience becomes luminous because the seeker no longer views it through the lens of personal interpretation. Teachers from the Hermetic tradition describe this phenomenon using the image of a clear river. When the water is turbulent, the reflections on its surface appear distorted and scattered. But when the water becomes calm, the reflections settle into clarity. The reflections are still reflections, yet their nature becomes obvious. In the same way, when the seeker's mind becomes quiet, the world's reflections are seen for what they are. They no longer deceive, they no longer create identity. They simply appear and dissolve without leaving residue. At this stage, seekers often experience a deep sense of presence. They report that they can see the world without the constant commentary of the mind. A tree is no longer a symbol of growth or stability. It is simply a tree. A passerby is no longer a source of comparison or projection. They are simply a presence within the field of awareness. This simplicity feels liberating because it frees the seeker from the heavy burden of interpretation. The elders taught that this presence is the natural state of awareness when it is no longer entangled in narrative. Historical accounts from contemplative communities describe how this transparency transforms daily life. Ordinary activities such as walking, eating, or speaking take on a new quality. The seeker experiences them directly without filtering them through identity. They may notice subtle sensations, sounds, or shifts in light that once went unnoticed. Nothing becomes extraordinary, everything becomes intimate. The world feels closer because the boundary between the observer and the observed has thinned. The mystics warn that the transparency of form should not be mistaken for detachment. It is not indifference. It is a deeper form of engagement. The seeker becomes more present, not less. They respond to life with clarity rather than habit. Compassion arises naturally because the lines dividing self from other become less defined. This compassion does not come from moral obligation. It emerges from the recognition that all experiences arise within the same field of awareness. Teachers in the desert lineages often said that when the world becomes transparent, the illusion loses its authority. Atheron's craftsmanship relies on the belief that the world is external and separate. When the seeker sees through this belief, the reflective realm no longer holds them. They are not pulled by desire or pushed by fear. They simply move through life with awareness as their ground. This shift marks a profound stage in awakening. The world remains as it is, yet the seeker experiences it as a living reflection within consciousness. The transparency of form reveals that awakening is not an escape from the world, but a transformation of how the world is perceived. The illusion dissolves because the seeker no longer mistakes the reflection for the source. In the surviving teachings of the early mystic circles near Antioch, elders spoke of a curious turning point when the deepest questions that once fueled the seeker's journey begin to lose their urgency. These questions originally carried the seeker through countless stages of inquiry. What is truth? What is awakening? What is the nature of the self? The elders understood these questions to be essential in the beginning because they direct the mind away from surface concerns and toward the inner world. Yet they also taught that these same questions eventually become barriers. They persist only as long as the seeker believes that answers lie somewhere beyond immediate awareness. Students who neared the end of the path often described a subtle shift in their relationship to questioning. They noticed that the intensity once surrounding these inquiries started to fade. The need to search for definitive explanations weakened. It was not that they had found all the answers. It was that the answers no longer seemed necessary in the way they once did. The elders explained that this shift occurs when the seeker begins to recognize that every question arises within consciousness. When the focus turns from the content of the question to the field in which it appears, the question loses its grip. Mystics from the Hermetic schools referred to this phenomenon as the emptying of the cup. They taught that as long as the cup is filled with questions, beliefs, and interpretations, it cannot hold the clarity of direct perception. But when the cup naturally empties without force or suppression, a new kind of understanding emerges. This understanding does not rely on concepts. It arises from the recognition that awareness itself is the answer to the questions it observes. The elders described this as understanding without thought, a quiet knowing that exists prior to language. In accounts preserved by contemplative writers, students often expressed concern when their questions began to fade. They feared that this loss of inquiry indicated a decline in dedication or insight. The elders reassured them that this was a sign of maturation rather than regression. They explained that spiritual questioning is like a ladder. It is necessary to climb, but once the seeker reaches the rooftop, the ladder is no longer needed. The disappearance of the final questions signals that the rooftop has been reached, even if the seeker has not yet realized it fully. The mystics also pointed out that questions continue to arise even at this stage, but they no longer bind the seeker. They appear lightly, like ripples on a clear pond. They do not create tension. They do not demand answers. They pass through awareness without anchoring themselves in identity. This lightness reveals a profound truth. The seeker's relationship to the mind has changed. The mind no longer defines the seeker's sense of self. It becomes a function rather than a master. Teachers in the desert traditions emphasized that this shift in questioning marks the weakening of Atheron's final hold. The reflective realm depends on the mind searching for meaning in its own reflections. When the seeker no longer seeks answers from perception, the illusion loses its ability to anchor them. There is nothing left for the reflective realm to offer because its knowledge is constructed from the very questions the seeker has now released. As the final questions dissolve, something deeper emerges. The The seeker discovers a quiet presence that does not need explanation. It does not need to understand itself. It simply exists, radiant and unmoving. This presence is the same awareness that has been observing the journey from the beginning. It was never separated from truth. It only appeared to be separated because the mind was distracted by its own inquiries. The elders often said that the disappearance of the final questions signals the completion of the inner turning. The seeker no longer looks outward for truth. The movement inward is complete. What remains is a presence that cannot be questioned because it is the ground from which all questions arise. In this presence, the illusion has nothing left to imitate. In the preserved writings of contemplatives from the Eastern Mediterranean, there is a teaching that often appears only in the later stages of a student's training. It states that as the illusion weakens, the seeker's relationship to time begins to change. This teaching was never meant to suggest that physical time ceases. Instead, it points to a shift in perception. The elders taught that Atheron's reflective realm relies heavily on time because time reinforces identity. The self is built from memories, expectations, and narratives that unfold along a temporal line. When the grip of identity loosens, time as a psychological structure begins to unravel. Students who approached the deeper phases of awakening frequently reported that their sense of past and future became softer. Memories remained accessible, but they no longer carried emotional weight. The future still existed as a concept, but it no longer generated anticipation or fear. Instead of viewing their life as a story progressing through time, seekers began to experience it as a continuous present in which events rose and fell like waves. The elders explained that this perception was not a mystical alteration of reality, but a clearer reflection of how awareness actually functions. Awareness does not move through time. It witnesses the movement of time within itself. Teachers from the Hermetic tradition described this transformation through the metaphor of a thread. Ordinary perception follows a single thread along which events are strung. But as awareness deepens, the thread is seen not as a pathway, but as a creation of the mind. The events remain, but the thread holding them together dissolves. Without the thread, time loses its linear force. It becomes a field of unfolding rather than a path to follow. The mystics emphasized that this shift does not lead to confusion. It leads to freedom. The seeker is no longer bound to the story they once believed defined them. Historical accounts from contemplative communities describe moments when practitioners sensed that the boundaries between earlier and later began to blur. They found themselves remembering experiences without placing them in strict chronological order. These memories felt present, not distant, as if they were simply appearing in awareness rather than belonging to a timeline. The elders interpreted this as a sign that the seeker was moving beyond the structure of identity. The past no longer shaped their sense of self, because the self had loosened its attachment to narrative continuity. The mystics also observed that as the perception of time softened, the seeker's relationship to change transformed. When the mind interprets life through temporal progression, change appears threatening because it alters the story of the self. But when time unravels, change becomes another form of appearance. It arises and dissolves in the same field of awareness as all other experiences. This recognition brings a profound sense of ease. The seeker no longer resists change or clings to stability. They understand that both movements belong to the reflective realm and do not touch the stillness of awareness. The elders warned that the unraveling of time may initially feel disorienting. The seeker may sense that familiar mental structures are dissolving, yet they encourage students to trust this process. They taught that the illusion of time is one of Atheron's most pervasive creations because it sustains the illusion of becoming. When the seeker recognizes that awareness does not become, the illusion begins to collapse. Time continues to function for practical purposes, but it loses its power to define the seeker. In the final teachings of several mystical traditions, this shift is described as the beginning of timeless awareness. It does not mean that the seeker enters a different realm. It means they perceive all realms from the perspective of the silent witness. The past becomes memory appearing now. The future becomes imagination appearing now. The present expands not as a moment within time, but as the field in which time appears. This unraveling of time marks a profound turning point. The seeker steps beyond the narrative that once defined them. Atheron's realm loses one of its strongest anchors. What remains is awareness itself, unbound by the movement of time, untouched by the stories that once shaped identity. In the teachings shared by the contemplative gatherings along the coast of Asia Minor, the elders spoke of a stage known as the inward return. This was not a journey in space or thought. It was a movement of attention back to the origin of all perception. Those who reached this point discovered that the path they had been walking did not lead outward toward a hidden truth. It curved inward, revealing that the source they sought had been present from the beginning. The elders described this return as the moment the seeker recognizes that the search itself has always been an expression of the source, not a route toward it. Students who experienced this inward return often reported a profound gentleness. They described it as the softest realization they had ever encountered. It did not arrive with revelation or ecstasy. It arrived with familiarity, as if they were coming home to something they had forgotten but never truly lost. The elders explained that this sense of homecoming arises because the source is not separate from awareness. It is awareness itself. The seeker does not reach it, they relax into it. In the writings of early mystics from the region near Cappadocia, this stage is portrayed through the imagery of a river returning to its spring. Along its journey, the river gathers branches, stones, and debris. It becomes turbulent and opaque, but as it approaches its source, these elements fall away. The river becomes clear. The elders used this metaphor to illustrate how the mind's interpretations fade as the seeker returns to the origin of perception. What remains is awareness free of narrative, free of identity, free of motion. This return is not an achievement, but a realization of what has always been true. Teachers in the Hermetic lineage emphasize that the inward return is marked by a shift in the nature of presence. The seeker no longer feels like an individual observing the world. They feel like the space in which the world appears. This shift does not erase individuality. It places individuality within a larger field of awareness. The elders described this as the merging of the drop with the sea, not through dissolution, but through recognition. The drop realizes it was never separate from the sea. It only appeared separate because of the boundaries imposed by thought. Historical accounts from early contemplative communities mention that this stage often brought a serene joy, though not the emotional joy associated with achievement. It was a quiet joy arising from the recognition that nothing had been missing. The elders taught that this joy is the natural expression of awareness when it is no longer burdened by seeking. It does not come from external circumstances or spiritual accomplishments. It arises from clarity itself, the clarity of seeing that the source was never concealed. The mystics were careful to clarify that the inward return does not mark the end of life's challenges. The world continues to unfold with its joys and difficulties, but the seeker's relationship to these experiences changes. They no longer feel threatened by change or loss because they no longer identify with the forms that come and go. They rest in the awareness that holds all experiences without being defined by them. This resting does not create distance from life. It deepens intimacy with it. The seeker becomes more responsive, not less, because they are no longer protecting a fragile identity. Teachers from the ancient desert schools often told their students that the inward return is the moment when Atheron's craftsmanship becomes fully transparent. The seeker sees that the illusion was never a barrier. It was a reflection that pointed back to the source. The reflection loses its power to deceive because the seeker no longer depends on it for meaning. The source within has become clear. The journey has become still. The seeker has become one who witnesses without grasping, one who rests without seeking. In this stage, the ancient teachers said, awakening is no longer a concept, it is a presence. It is the simple recognition that awareness has always been whole, always been complete, and always been the ground upon which every experience appears. The seeker returns to this source not by moving, but by noticing. The noticing is the return is the realization, and the realization is the quiet illumination that no imitation can mimic. In the teachings preserved by the contemplative schools of the Anatolian highlands, the elders described a stage when the subtle worlds crafted by Atheron begin to lose their allure. These worlds, known among early mystics as the imitation realms, were believed to exist between the physical world and the true domain of awareness. They were not realms of deception in a malicious sense. Rather, they were reflections designed to mirror the higher truth without carrying its essence. Their purpose, the elders taught, was to reveal the limits of perception shaped by identity. When the seeker rested in the inward return, these imitation realms started to thin, like mist dissolving under morning light. Students who approached this stage often found that experiences once considered profound began to feel less compelling. Visions, insights, and states of heightened perception that once inspired awe now appeared as natural movements within awareness. The elders explained that this was not a loss of sensitivity but a refinement of perception. The seeker was no longer drawn into the content of experience. They saw that even the most radiant visions belonged to the reflective realm and were shaped by the mind's interpretations. This recognition softened the fascination that once animated the spiritual search. Mystics from the desert communities often used the analogy of a lantern. In the early stages, the lantern's glow seems brilliant because the surrounding space is dark, but as dawn approaches, the lantern's light fades in comparison to the expanding brightness. In a similar way, the imitation worlds lose their significance when the seeker begins to rest in the presence beyond duality. The reflective light that once captivated them now seems dim beside the clarity of awareness itself. This fading is not a rejection of the imitation realms. It is the natural consequence of seeing their dependence on perception. Historical accounts describe seekers who reached this stage noticing that emotional reactions grew milder. Feelings still arose, but they passed through without leaving traces. Thoughts still appeared, but they no longer formed narratives. Even subtle spiritual impressions, once cherished as signs of progress, dissolved quickly. The elders interpreted this as a sign that the reflective realm was losing its ability to anchor the seeker. The imitation worlds remained visible, but their influence diminished. They appeared as conditions within awareness, rather than destinations of meaning. Teachers in the Hermetic lineage emphasized that this fading is not a withdrawal from experience. It is an expansion of clarity. When the imitation worlds lose their gravity, life becomes simpler without becoming empty. The seeker continues to engage with the world, but with a new kind of ease. There is no longer an effort to extract meaning from experience because meaning is no longer tied to interpretation. The elders taught that this ease marks one of the final movements of awakening. The reflective realm loses its authority because the seeker no longer relies on it for identity. Some mystics describe the fading of the imitation worlds as the unraveling of enchantment. They explain that Atheron's craftsmanship relies on the mind's tendency to assign significance to appearance. When that habit dissolves, the spell loosens. The imitation realms remain beautiful, but they no longer bind the seeker's attention. They become part of the natural display of awareness, neither rejected nor pursued. This neutrality is not indifference, it is clarity. The seeker sees the reflective realm as it is, without projecting desire or fear onto it. In the final teachings of the ancient contemplative traditions, this stage is depicted as the clearing of the sky. Clouds may still drift across the expanse, but they no longer obscure the vastness. The imitation worlds may continue to arise in moments of introspection or heightened awareness, but they no longer confuse the seeker. The distinction between reflection and essence becomes unmistakable. The elders taught that this clarity is what allows the last remnants of the illusion to unravel. At this stage, the seeker stands on the threshold of true awakening, not because they have transcended the imitation realms, but because they see through them. The fading of these worlds reveals the constancy of awareness behind all appearances. The illusion loses its complexity, the path loses its distance. What remains is a simplicity that cannot be imitated, a presence that cannot be copied, and a stillness that marks the final dissolution of Atheron's design. In the final teachings of the ancient contemplative traditions, preserved across scattered manuscripts and oral lineages, the elders spoke of a moment when the entire journey reveals its paradox. They called this the arrival without arrival. It signified the dissolution of the last remnants of the seeking mind. Throughout the path, the seeker believed there was somewhere to reach, some higher plane of clarity or liberation awaiting them beyond the reflection of Atheron's worlds. Yet when the illusion finally recedes and the imitation realms fade into transparency, the seeker discovers that the destination they sought has always been present. It has never been distant, never hidden, never attainable because it is not separate from awareness itself. Students who crossed into this final understanding often described a profound stillness, not as an experience but as a recognition. It felt like stepping into a room they had unknowingly lived in all their lives. Their attention had been so captivated by the shadows on the walls that they had overlooked the space in which those shadows appeared. The elders taught that this recognition marks the unraveling of Atheron's final snare. The illusion cannot hold the seeker because the seeker has vanished into the clarity of pure awareness. There is no longer an identity for the illusion to anchor. Awareness stands alone, simple and unadorned. In the commentaries of early mystics, this final stage is described as a soft merging rather than a dramatic breakthrough. The seeker does not feel elevated, transformed, or enlightened. They feel natural. They feel as though they have returned to the most familiar aspect of being, the presence that watched every movement of thought, emotion, and perception throughout the journey. This presence was never obscured. It only appeared hidden because the mind was absorbed in the reflections projected by Atheron's craftsmanship. When the fascination with these reflections fades, the presence becomes unmistakable. The elders emphasized that awakening in this sense is not an event. It is not a shift from one state to another. It is the recognition that awareness does not shift, it does not evolve, it does not ascend, it is constant. What changes is the relationship the seeker has with experience. They no longer interpret awareness through the lens of identity. They no longer search for meaning in reflections. They rest in the clarity that precedes all interpretation. This resting is the essence of awakening. It is effortless because effort belongs to the reflective realm. Awareness simply is. Teachers in the Hermetic tradition express this insight through the image of a flame. When the flame burns steadily, it illuminates everything within its reach. But if one tries to grasp the flame or direct its movement, it flickers. The stillness of awakening resembles the steady flame. It shines naturally when the seeker stops trying to control, define, or possess it. The elders encouraged their students to approach this stage with humility, not because awakening requires devotion, but because humility prevents the mind from claiming ownership. The moment the mind declares that it has awakened, the illusion returns. Awareness cannot be possessed by identity. It reveals itself only when identity dissolves. Historical accounts from contemplative communities describe how this final recognition transforms daily life. The seeker continues to engage with the world, participate in conversations, and fulfill responsibilities, yet everything feels lighter. The world remains vibrant, but it no longer binds. The imitation realms may still appear in subtle moments of introspection, but they hold no authority. Experience flows without resistance. The elders taught that this is the natural condition of awareness when it is free from the gravity of interpretation. It does not withdraw from life. It moves through life with clarity and compassion. In the final lesson shared by the elders, they stated that the arrival without a rival is the true end of the path because it reveals that there was never a path. The journey existed only as long as the seeker believed they were separate from the source. When that belief dissolves, the journey dissolves with it. What remains is the quiet presence that has always been aware, always been whole, always been free. Atheron's craftsmanship loses all significance because reflections cannot bind awareness that no longer mistakes itself for the forms it perceives. The ancient teachers often concluded their instruction with a simple reminder. Awakening does not grant new powers or esoteric knowledge. It does not elevate the individual. It reveals the ground of being that underlies all experience. It is the recognition that awareness has always been here, waiting patiently for the seeker to notice that it has never moved. It has never changed. It has never been separate. In this recognition, the illusion fades and the final trap dissolves. And so the path ends where it began, in the quiet clarity of awareness itself. There is no ascension, there is no descent, there is only the realization that the source was never hidden. It was simply overlooked. This is the arrival without a rival, the end of seeking, the recognition that what remains is what has always been true.